Marvel Tōkon, Fighting Souls is the result of a combination that makes a lot of sense on paper. Arc System Works, a Japanese studio respected for technical and visually striking fighting games, working alongside Sony's XDev team and Marvel Games. This partnership didn't come out of nowhere, as Sony already came from a successful collaboration with Marvel on the Spider-Man series, and clearly wanted to capitalize on that relationship to create its own fighting game featuring the brand. From a development standpoint, this gives me the impression of a project with significant institutional weight behind it, almost a prestige project for Sony within the fighting game genre, rather than just another licensed game. The official announcement took place in June 2025 during a State of Play, accompanied even by a documentary showing behind-the-scenes footage of the team. I found it interesting that, ever since, Sony and Arc System Works opted for a well-staggered reveal strategy, testing the game in stages with the public instead of simply releasing it and seeing what happens. There was an exclusive PS5 closed beta shortly after the announcement, another closed round showcasing 8 characters and some modes months later, and now this cross-platform open beta running on both PS5 and PC right before launch. To me, this sounds like a studio genuinely gathering balance and performance feedback along the way, rather than just putting on a marketing demo. The game is under the direction of Kazuto Sekine, a name that carries weight within Arc System Works due to his history with the house's other fighters, and this is heavily reflected in the combat feel I experienced in the beta. The choice to run everything on Unreal Engine 5 also stands out, because it shows a commitment to high-end visual production, trying to balance that anime-style Arc System Works typically delivers with Marvel's Western roster. It's clear the team wanted to give the project an authorial identity instead of simply outsourcing a generic licensed game, and that is something I truly value when following development. The 4-character team system, assists, and the wall break mechanic clearly draw inspiration from Marvel vs. Capcom and Dragon Ball FighterZ, and I see this as a calculated development decision to attract both genre veterans and Marvel fans who may have never played a tag fighter before. At the same time, this familiarity with well-known formulas makes me question to what extent the team is genuinely innovating versus just refining something that has worked before in other games. At the end of the day, what I see is careful development, but without much margin for error, because the release date is right around the corner and there are still visible loose ends, especially regarding the PC version's performance. It's one of those cases where the studio's pedigree and heavy backing from Sony generate high expectations, but the final execution will depend on how well they manage to close those gaps in the coming weeks ahead of the August 6th, 2026 launch. Judging solely by the open beta, I felt that the game wants to be accessible without giving up spectacle. The foundation feels much more immediate than a traditional tag fighter, yet still leaves room for expression, which is precisely the type of balance that leaves me curious rather than suspicious. The first point that caught my attention was the pacing. The game seems designed to get you into the flow quickly, without constantly fighting complicated inputs, and this fits well with the goal of making fights explosive and easy to understand in the heat of battle. At the same time, it didn't feel like it was trying to become a truly automatic game. It feels more like an entryway than a lazy simplification. I also really like the idea of a team system that expands during the match. Starting out more contained and unlocking resources mid-match gives a really cool sense of progression, almost as if the fight grows alongside the tension. To me, this helps the game forge its own identity within the genre, because swapping characters isn't just done for the sake of it. There is a dynamic build-up happening the entire time. What I found most interesting, honestly, is how the gameplay seems to want to feel great on the controller before becoming complex in the lab. From what was shown and what the beta let us see, the moves have clean readability, attacks feel responsive, and the transitions between normals, specials, and assists give that fluid combat feel that hooks you fast. It's the kind of game where, even when you don't master everything, it's still fun just pressing buttons and watching the fight unfold. On the other hand, I completely understand the concern of anyone looking at the beta and feeling like there might be too little technical friction in the system. The presence of simplified inputs, auto combos, and a friendlier structure might lead some players to think depth will be overly concentrated on the bare minimum. For me, the risk isn't the game being simple. The risk is it failing to give players enough reason to keep evolving after the novelty wears off. Even so, I don't feel like the concept is empty. From what has been disclosed, the combination of tags, assists, and team expansion timing creates a kind of match reading that can get quite strategic at a higher level, especially if the game truly rewards those who better understand positioning, confirm routes, and clever resource management. In other words, it looks easy to pick up, but feels like it can become much more interesting once the player starts exploring beyond the obvious. I thought the gameplay was born with a very fun foundation, great visuals, and plenty of personality, but it still depends on what the final version does with this structure. If the game manages to turn this accessibility into real depth, it has everything it takes to be a very special fighter. If not, it will end up remembered more for its flash than its substance. From what the team shared, the name Tōkon means fighting spirit, and the subtitle, Fighting Souls, came from the beam of light that appears when characters tag in and out, interpreted by the developers as a soul. This gives me the impression that the narrative is being built straight from the game's core mechanic itself, which is a smart concept, but at the same time makes it feel like the story might end up being more of a symbolic idea rather than a genuinely strong plot. In the open beta, what could be seen of the story mode was still very little, feeling more like a sample of what's to come than a true narrative experience. For me, it functioned more as a character and general tone introduction rather than an arc with a beginning, middle, and end that left any lasting impression. So, honestly, it's still not the kind of game that makes me talk about the story with excitement. What leaves me more interested is the episode mode proposal in the final version, because it seems to be the smartest way to bring the roster to life. Instead of trying to create a single giant narrative for everyone, the game can better explore the relationships between heroes and villains, which fits a tag fighter extremely well. If they pull this off right, the story can gain personality without needing to pretend it's telling a grand cinematic saga. Another point that seems promising is the way developers talk about each character's lore. The idea that everyone will have their own backstory and respected elements from the source material is a good sign, because it shows care for each hero's identity. But at the same time, loose lore isn't the same as an engaging narrative, so I'm still keeping a foot back until I see how all of this connects inside the game. I also think the stages do a lot of heavy lifting in carrying the world's atmosphere. Wakanda, the X-Mansion, the Savage Land, New York, and even Nowhere already convey that lived-in Marvel Universe feeling, and this helps give weight to the narrative context, even without a heavily developed story in the beta. To me, these stages seem to hold a good chunk of the game's charm when it comes to world building. My impression is that the story of Marvel Tōkon, Fighting Souls, will likely function more as a supporting structure for the roster than as a standalone major highlight. And frankly, for a fighting game, that might already be enough, as long as the characters have presence and the interactions truly convey the feeling that this universe has a life of its own. What I've seen so far didn't sell me an unforgettable story, but it sold a foundation with potential, and that's already more than many people expect. My impression of the graphics is quite positive. The game has a strong visual identity, and that stands out right at first glance. What hooked me the most was the art direction. Marvel here isn't trying to look realistic, or follow that cinematic finish common in other fighting games. It embraces a more stylized, anime-like aesthetic, and this works exceptionally well for this type of game. To me, this choice grants personality and makes the game instantly stand out. The characters, overall, convey a sense of great care in their design. Even without getting into gameplay details, you can tell the team wanted to turn these heroes into more expressive versions purposely crafted for a fighting game, featuring striking silhouettes and attacks that look great on screen. This helps immensely because, visually, every fighter feels like they have presence. In combat, what impresses most is the movement. Animations are fluid and the effects give everything plenty of visual weight, so every hit carries an impact that sells the action well. At the same time, I felt the game manages to keep a relatively clean read most of the time, which is important in a fighting game. I also really like the look of the stages. The arenas don't feel like mere backgrounds. They help create that high-budget anime spectacle feeling, featuring bold colors and composition that grabs attention without becoming overly cluttered. It's the kind of game where you pause for a few seconds just to observe the scene before starting the match. If I have to point out a caveat, I'd say the visuals can lose a bit of clarity when the screen gets too crowded with assists and effects. It's not something that destroys the experience, but in a fighting game, that always weighs heavily, because a pretty graphic also needs to be legible. The graphics of Marvel Tōkon, Fighting Souls are one of the game's strongest points. It isn't just pretty, it has its own visual identity, and that is worth far more than simply spamming the screen with glow and particles. My impression of performance is that it fell well short of what I expected for such an important beta. Playing the open beta and seeing what the developer had been showing, I got the feeling the game wanted to project an image of extreme polish, but in practice, stability didn't keep up with that ambition. What bothers me most is that the issues don't feel like minor beta tweaks. They convey a sense of structural stuttering. Some friends reported stuttering, frame drops, and difficulty maintaining 60 frames per second even on powerful rigs, and that gives the impression the game is demanding more than it should. On PC, for me, the situation was the most frustrating part. My reading is that the game became too heavy for what it delivers on screen, with very aggressive CPU usage and an optimization that still doesn't look ready to welcome the public with confidence. When a fighting game starts wrestling with your hardware before you even enter a match, it already triggers a major red flag. Even so, I don't think this stems from a lack of potential, but rather execution issues at that stage of the beta. The team itself acknowledged the gameplay and performance issues on the PC version and stated they were investigating fixes, which at least shows they didn't ignore community backlash. But to be honest, that matters very little to the player at the exact moment the experience is already compromised. Another thought that crossed my mind is that when performance fluctuates, everything else loses power. In a fighting game, responsiveness must be immediate, and any hitch robs the player's confidence when defending, reacting, or simply feeling like the match is flowing the way it should. Then the issue stops being purely technical and begins affecting the core game experience. The strangest part is that this feeling of instability showed up precisely in a game that seemed to want to sell visual safety and fast pacing. So, in my view, performance ended up slightly contradicting the highly polished product image suggested by the promotional material. It's one of those cases where the trailer and the beta seem to speak different languages. I thought the performance was still below the level I wanted to see, especially on PC. I would walk away from this open beta with cautious optimism, but without pretending everything is fine, because the technical foundation needs to improve significantly to keep up with the game's premise. I would say Marvel Tōkon Fighting Souls looks like a game that deserves attention at launch, because its premise is strong and has projected a very clear identity since the promotional materials dropped. Even with some less encouraging signs in the open beta, that lingering feeling remains that the game is being shaped to arrive in a much more tuned version. The open beta didn't give me total confidence regarding performance, that's true. It had that test-like aura that still needed refinement, carrying the impression that not everything was in top shape to represent the final build. But looking at the big picture of what the developer showcased, I can envision a much rounder launch than that initial slice made it seem. And that changes the reading of the game quite a bit, because when you combine a striking visual design, an ambitious-looking system, and a foundation that clearly turns heads, it's hard not to think that launch might be the moment where everything clicks into place. Sometimes the beta shows precisely that, what still needs fixing, not necessarily the final outcome. Because of this, I think it might be worth buying at launch, especially for anyone who likes jumping into a fighting game early and following the community's growth from the start. In this type of game, picking it up on day one carries a different weight, because you experience the phase where everyone is figuring things out simultaneously. At the same time, I would still temper that interest with a certain degree of caution. Not because the game looks weak, but because the beta left that natural, minor doubt regarding stability and refinement. Yet, frankly, I view this more as a phase-related matter than a definitive problem. Overall, my impression is that Marvel Tōkon Fighting Souls has solid chances of arriving at launch in a more polished state than the beta suggested. So day one purchase feels like a real possibility to me, especially for anyone already hyped about the project since its announcement. I'd say the open beta raised a few eyebrows, but it didn't take the game down. Most likely, the final version will deliver a safer experience, and that's why the launch ends up looking like a bet that could very well pay off.